The gold-embossed invitation sat on the kitchen counter like a taunt. Madison Hart picked it up for the third time that morning, her 7-month pregnant belly pressing against the marble edge as she read the elegant script once more. Morrison Tech Industries cordially invites you to our annual gala celebrating 10 years of innovation. Black tie. Partners welcome. Partners welcome. Unless, apparently, you were married to the CEO. I already told you, Madison. This isn't the right event for you. Derek's voice cut through her thoughts as he entered the kitchen, adjusting platinum cufflinks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 38, her husband still possessed the sharp features and commanding presence that had first attracted her 5 years ago, but lately those features seemed carved from ice rather than flesh. It's your company's 10th anniversary gala, Madison said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded stomach where their daughter had been kicking all morning. I'm your wife. Why wouldn't I attend? Derek poured himself coffee with mechanical precision, not meeting her eyes. Because Vanessa will be there. The name landed between them like a grenade. Vanessa Chen, the 26-year-old marketing director Derek had hired 8 months ago. The woman whose texts lit up his phone at midnight. The woman Madison had pretended not to notice until pretending became impossible. So I'm being uninvited to my own husband's company event because your employee will be there? Madison heard her voice climb higher despite her attempt to stay calm. Do you hear how insane that sounds? Vanessa isn't just an employee. She's essential to Morrison Tech's public image. Derek finally looked at her, his expression suggesting he was explaining something to a slow child. She understands the tech world, knows how to work a room, represents the kind of forward-thinking brand we're building. You. He gestured vaguely at her swollen form. You look tired, Madison. You'd be uncomfortable all night. It's better if you rest. Madison felt something cold settle in her chest. I look pregnant, Derek. I look like I'm carrying your child. You look like you're about to pop, he replied with casual cruelty. The gala is photographed by every tech publication in the country. I need Morrison Tech to project success, innovation, youth. Not. He trailed off, but the unspoken word hung there anyway. Domesticity. When did you become this person? Madison whispered. When did you turn into someone who's ashamed of his own family? Derek's jaw tightened. I'm not ashamed. I'm practical. This is a business event, Madison, not a family reunion. Vanessa has already coordinated with the event planner, organized the seating arrangements, prepared talking points for investors. She's been integral to making this night perfect. She's been integral, Madison repeated slowly. Your marketing director has been planning your anniversary gala. Tell me, Derek, does she have talking points prepared for when people ask where your pregnant wife is? People in tech don't care about personal lives. They care about innovation, disruption, the future. Derek checked his Rolex with obvious impatience. Look, I don't have time for this drama. The gala starts at 7. I'll be home late. Don't wait up. He moved toward the door, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor Madison had chosen when they'd bought this house 3 years ago. Back when Derek still called her his partner, his equal, his everything. My father asked if we'd be attending together, Madison said to his retreating back. Derek froze, his hand on the doorknob. For the first time that morning, something like uncertainty crossed his face. Your father? Yes. James Carter. You remember him, right? The man who walked me down the aisle when we got married? Madison's voice was steady now, cold with a kind of calm she hadn't known she possessed. The Attorney General of our state, who happens to have very strong opinions about family values and public accountability. Derek turned slowly. What did you tell him? I told him we'd discuss it. That you might want me to rest given how late in my pregnancy I am. Madison met his gaze without flinching. I didn't tell him that my husband doesn't want his pregnant wife photographed at his company gala because she doesn't fit his brand image. I thought I'd give you a chance to reconsider that decision first. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Madison watched calculations run behind Derek's eyes, the political connections James Carter wielded, the investigations an attorney general could quietly initiate, the regulatory scrutiny Morrison Tech could face if Derek made an enemy of the state's top law enforcement official. "Fine," Derek said finally, the word ground out like broken glass. "Come to the gala if you want." "But Madison?" His voice dropped to something dangerous. "Don't embarrass me. Don't make a scene. And stay away from the investor conversations. This night is too important to risk with your hormonal unpredictability." He left without waiting for a response, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Madison stood alone in the kitchen they'd designed together, surrounded by the life they'd built, and felt the baby kick hard against her ribs as if her daughter already understood that something fundamental had shifted. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized at age 6. "Dad," she said when James Carter's familiar voice answered. "I need to talk to you about something. Something important." "I'm always here for you, sweetheart," her father replied, his tone shifting to the careful attention that had made him one of the most formidable prosecutors in state history before his appointment as Attorney General. "What's going on?" Madison looked at the gold-embossed invitation, at the wedding photo on the wall showing Derek gazing at her with what she believed was love, at her reflection in the darkened window, a pregnant woman standing alone in a house that suddenly felt like a museum of her own naivety. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time you knew what kind of man your son-in-law has become." The Morrison Tech headquarters occupied prime real estate in the city's revitalized downtown district, a glass and steel monument to Derek's ambition. Madison had been there countless times during the company's early years, back when Morrison Tech operated out of a converted warehouse with 15 employees and dreams of disrupting the enterprise software market. Now the company employed over 400 people, held patents worth millions, and counted Fortune 500 companies among its client base. Derek had built something extraordinary. Madison had been proud of him once. She walked through the marble lobby at 6:45, her emerald silk dress flowing over her pregnant form with elegant defiance. The dress had cost a small fortune, but Madison had learned from her mother, a federal judge, that armor came in many forms. Tonight, hers was designer maternity wear and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and whose daughter she was. The elevator carried her to the rooftop venue where Morrison Tech's gala was already in full swing. Through the glass walls, she could see the city lights spreading out like scattered diamonds, a backdrop for the carefully curated success Derek had orchestrated. Madison stepped into the ballroom and felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. She watched recognition ripple through the crowd as people registered Derek's pregnant wife arriving at an event she'd apparently been meant to skip. Derek stood near the bar, Vanessa Chin beside him in a red dress that left little to the imagination. They were laughing at something a silver-haired investor had said, their body language speaking of easy intimacy and shared understanding. Vanessa's hand rested casually on Derek's arm, a gesture of possession that made Madison's jaw clench. Then Derek saw her. The color drained from his face so quickly that the investor actually asked if he was feeling well. Madison watched her husband excuse himself and cross the ballroom with forced casualness, his smile never wavering even as fury blazed in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he hissed when he reached her, his voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. "I thought we agreed, you decided," Madison interrupted softly. "I simply chose not to accept your decision. This is your company's anniversary, Derek. I've been part of Morrison Tech's journey since the beginning. I'm not hiding at home like some shameful secret. You're making a scene. I'm standing in a ballroom. If that constitutes a scene, perhaps the problem isn't my presence." Madison accepted a sparkling water from a passing waiter, noting how Derek's eyes tracked every movement, calculating the damage her appearance might cause to whatever narrative he'd constructed. Vanessa materialized beside them, her perfect smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, what a surprise. Derek mentioned you weren't feeling well enough to attend." "Did he?" Madison turned her full attention to the younger woman. "How considerate of my husband to be so concerned about my health. Though I have to say, I'm feeling remarkably energized tonight. How lovely. Vanessa's smile sharpened. Though perhaps you should sit down? You look uncomfortable. I look pregnant, Madison replied pleasantly. There's a difference. But thank you for your concern. She let her gaze drift deliberately to where Vanessa's hand still rested on Derek's arm. You two seem very close. Have you been working together long? 8 months, Vanessa replied without missing a beat. Derek and I have developed quite the partnership. We just understand each other, you know? Same vision, same drive, same dedication to making Morrison Tech the industry leader. The emphasis on same wasn't subtle. Madison felt the baby kick and placed her hand over the movement, watching Vanessa's eyes flicker to her stomach with something that looked like calculation. How wonderful for you both, Madison said. Partnerships are so important in business. Almost as important as in marriage. She turned to Derek, whose jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. Speaking of which, darling, my father asked me to remind you about our dinner next week. He has some questions about Morrison Tech's recent compliance filings. Derek's face went pale. What questions? Oh, just routine things. Madison's smile was pure innocence. You know how thorough Dad is about regulatory oversight. Something about data privacy protocols and federal contract requirements. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but crystal clear. James Carter's routine questions had ended careers and triggered federal investigations. Derek understood the implication perfectly. Madison, he said tightly, could we talk privately for a moment? Of course, darling. She followed him toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, aware of curious eyes tracking their movement. Behind them, Vanessa stood alone near the bar, her expression no longer quite so confident. Derek waited until they were out of earshot before turning on her with barely controlled fury. What the hell are you doing? Threatening me with your father's position? That's low, Madison. Even for you. Low? Madison's calm cracked slightly. You barred your pregnant wife from attending your company gala because she doesn't fit your brand image. You've been carrying on with your marketing director for months. You've become someone I don't even recognize. And you think I'm being low? Vanessa and I are colleagues, stop lying to me. The words came out sharper than she intended, drawing glances from nearby guests. Madison lowered her voice to a fierce whisper. I'm not stupid, Derek. I've seen the texts. The hotel charges on our credit card. The way you look at her. Just stop pretending and have the decency to be honest about what's happening. Derek's expression shifted, something like guilt flickering across his face before hardening into defensive anger. You want honesty? Fine. Yes, Vanessa understands me in ways you haven't for years. Yes, she makes me feel alive instead of trapped. And yes, when I look at you now, all I see is someone who represents everything I'm trying to escape. The words landed like physical blows, but Madison forced herself to remain standing, to keep breathing through the pain. What are you trying to escape, Derek? Our marriage? Our child? Or just the version of yourself that made promises he no longer wants to keep? I'm trying to escape mediocrity. Derek's voice rose before he caught himself, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. Morrison Tech is on the verge of explosive growth. We're negotiating partnerships with companies that could triple our valuation. I need to be sharp, focused, unencumbered by domestic concerns that drag me down. Our daughter is a domestic concern that drags you down. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Madison felt tears threaten but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Not when she needed to be strong. When did you stop wanting to be a father, Derek? When did our family become an obstacle instead of the whole point? The point was building something that mattered. Derek's frustration boiled over. The point was creating technology that changes industries, that disrupts markets, that puts Morrison Tech on the map as an innovation leader. Not settling into suburban domesticity and pretending that's enough. I never asked you to settle. You got pregnant. The words hung between them like poison. Madison stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in months. Our daughter wasn't an accident, Derek. We planned this pregnancy. We talked about starting a family. You were the one who said you wanted kids before you turned 40. That was before the Series C funding came through. Before the acquisition offers started rolling in. Before I realized what Morrison Tech could actually become. Derek ran a hand through his hair, his carefully maintained composure cracking. I can't be the father you want me to be and the CEO I need to be. Something has to give, Madison. And I'm not giving up what I've built. So you're giving up us. I'm choosing my future over your fantasy of what our marriage was supposed to be. Madison felt something inside her chest break cleanly, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The finality in Derek's voice told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a rough patch in their marriage. This was the end, delivered in a rooftop ballroom full of tech investors and enterprise software executives who would probably applaud Derek's ruthless prioritization. Okay, she said quietly. Derek blinked, clearly surprised by her calm acceptance. Okay? Okay. I understand now. Madison straightened her spine, her hand resting protectively over her daughter. You've made your choice. I'm making mine. What does that mean? Before Madison could respond, the ballroom's attention shifted dramatically. Conversations died. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Madison turned to see what had caused the sudden silence and felt her breath catch. Her father had arrived. James Carter entered the Morrison Tech Gala with the quiet authority that came from 30 years in law enforcement and judicial service. At 62, he still possessed the commanding presence that had made him legendary as a prosecutor, the silver-haired statesman who'd sent corrupt politicians and white-collar criminals to federal prison with equal efficiency. Tonight, he wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo and an expression that Madison recognized from childhood. The look that said someone had crossed a line, and consequences were coming. Mr. Attorney General, Derek stammered, his professional polish deserting him entirely. What a surprise. We didn't expect, my daughter invited me, James said pleasantly, crossing the ballroom to kiss Madison's cheek. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Better now that you're here, Dad. Madison felt some of the evening's tension ease from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she wasn't alone. James turned his attention to Derek, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Derek. I hope you don't mind me crashing your anniversary celebration. When Madison told me about the event, I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to see what Morrison Tech has accomplished. Quite impressive growth over the past few years. Thank you, sir. We've worked very hard, I'm sure you have. James accepted a drink from a waiter, his gaze sweeping the ballroom with the systematic assessment of someone trained to spot irregularities. Though I have to admit, I was surprised when Madison mentioned you'd initially suggested she skip the gala. Something about not fitting the brand image? The color drained from Derek's face. Around them, nearby conversations had gone completely silent as tech executives and investors strained to hear the exchange between Morrison Tech's CEO and the state's Attorney General. I was concerned about her comfort level, given how late in the pregnancy, how thoughtful, James interrupted smoothly. Though as I recall, my wife attended multiple formal events during her third trimester with Madison. Even argued a case before the state Supreme Court at 8 months pregnant. Strong women don't let pregnancy slow them down, do they, sweetheart? No, Dad, Madison said softly. They don't. James's attention shifted to Vanessa, who'd been hovering near the bar with increasing discomfort. And you must be the famous Vanessa Chen. Madison's told me so much about you. Marketing director, correct? Yes, sir. Vanessa's confidence had evaporated in the face of James Carter's judicial scrutiny. I've been with Morrison Tech for 8 months. 8 months, James repeated thoughtfully. Fascinating timing. Derek, didn't you mention in our last conversation that Morrison Tech was restructuring its executive team right around then? Something about bringing in fresh perspective? Derek looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. We brought Vanessa on to modernize our market positioning, by replacing your previous marketing director, who'd been with the company since its founding. James's tone remained pleasant, but Madison recognized the prosecutorial edge underneath. The one who actually built Morrison Tech's brand from nothing? I believe her name was Sarah Chen. Any relation to Vanessa? Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's my older sister, actually. She recommended me for the position when she decided to pursue other opportunities. Decided, James said. Or was encouraged to pursue those opportunities after Derek here developed an interest in replacing her with someone younger? He let the implication hang in the air. Forgive me, I've spent so many years investigating employment discrimination cases that I tend to see patterns where none exist. The assembled guests had gone completely silent now, a ballroom full of witnesses watching the Attorney General systematically dismantle Morrison Tech's CEO with nothing but carefully phrased questions and pointed implications. Derek's face had gone from pale to flushed with humiliation and rage. Sir, with all due respect, my company's employment decisions are perfectly legal and above board. We have comprehensive HR policies, I'm sure you do, James agreed. Though I have to wonder about those federal contracts Madison mentioned. The ones requiring strict compliance with federal workplace standards. You do maintain proper documentation for all hiring and termination decisions, don't you? The government tends to get quite particular about that when companies hold contracts involving sensitive data. Derek's eyes widened with understanding. Morrison Tech's largest client was a federal agency whose contract accounted for 30% of the company's revenue. A contract that required cordially compliance certifications and could be terminated immediately for policy violations. Dad, Madison said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. Maybe we should let Derek get back to his guests. James looked down at his daughter, and his expression softened. You're right, sweetheart. This is Derek's big night. We wouldn't want to spoil it with uncomfortable questions. He turned back to Derek with a smile that had sent better men running for their lawyers. Though Derek, I would like to schedule that dinner Madison mentioned. Just some routine questions about Morrison Tech's compliance protocols. Nothing to worry about, I'm sure. Of course, sir. Anytime. Derek's voice had gone hollow. Excellent. James offered Madison his arm. Sweetheart, why don't we get some fresh air? All this corporate celebration is making me feel rather old and prosecutorial. Madison accepted her father's arm and let him guide her toward the ballroom's exterior terrace, aware of every eye following their movement. Behind them, she could hear conversations slowly resuming, the buzz of speculation about what they'd just witnessed. On the terrace, with the city lights spread below them and the cool night air washing away the ballroom's stifling atmosphere, Madison finally let her composure crack. Thank you, Dad. For what? Embarrassing your husband at his own gala? James's tone was gentle despite the words. For reminding me that I come from a family that doesn't accept being treated as less than we are. Madison wiped away tears that finally spilled over. For showing Derek that there are consequences for underestimating the people who love him. James pulled his daughter into a careful hug, mindful of her pregnant belly. Maddie, tell me honestly. Is your marriage over? Madison was quiet for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the gala continuing inside. Yes, she said finally. I think it's been over for months. I just didn't want to admit it. What do you want to do? I want to protect my daughter. I want to make sure Derek can't hurt us the way he's been hurting me. Madison pulled back to look at her father directly. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is Morrison Tech actually violating compliance regulations, or were you just rattling Derek's cage in there? James's expression turned serious. I wasn't rattling cages, sweetheart. I've had Morrison Tech under quiet review for 6 months. Madison felt the world tilt beneath her. What? After you mentioned Derek's behavior changes last year, I started looking into his company's practices. Nothing invasive, just routine oversight that falls under my office's jurisdiction. James leaned against the terrace railing, his voice taking on the careful precision of a prosecutor laying out a case. Morrison Tech holds 3 federal contracts worth approximately $12 million annually. Those contracts require strict compliance with workplace equity standards, data privacy protocols, and financial transparency requirements. And Derek's violating them. Derek's walking a very fine line between legal and actionable. The termination of Sarah Chen, for instance, Vanessa's older sister, was technically legal, but the circumstances raise questions. Sarah was replaced by her younger sister days after Derek began what appears to be a personal relationship with said younger sister. That pattern suggests potential discrimination based on age and possibly retaliation for unspecified complaints. Madison's mind raced. Sarah filed complaints? Not officially. But according to informal sources, she'd raised concerns about Derek's management style becoming increasingly erratic and his focus shifting away from company operations toward personal interests. James pulled out his phone and showed Madison a document. This is Sarah Chen's separation agreement. Notice the unusually high settlement amount for a marketing director with 8 years tenure? That's typically what companies pay when they're trying to avoid wrongful termination suits. How much did Derek pay her to go away quietly? $250,000. Plus a glowing recommendation letter and an NDA so restrictive that Sarah couldn't even tell her own family the real reason she left Morrison Tech. Madison stared at the numbers on her father's phone, feeling sick. He bought her silence so he could install Vanessa in her position. That's the pattern the evidence suggests. But Madison, there's more. James's expression grew darker. Morrison Tech's financial disclosures for their federal contracts show some irregularities that concern me. Expense classifications that don't quite add up. Travel expenditures that seem excessive for a company their size. Entertainment costs that raise questions about proper business purpose. Derek's been using company money to fund his affair with Vanessa. Potentially. Though proving that would require a full audit, which I'm not authorized to initiate without cause. James looked at his daughter carefully. Unless someone with direct knowledge of Morrison Tech's financial practices were to come forward with specific allegations of fraud or misappropriation. Understanding dawned slowly. You want me to be a whistleblower against my own husband? I want you to consider whether protecting Derek is worth sacrificing your own integrity and your daughter's future. James's voice was gentle but firm. Maddie, if Morrison Tech is misusing federal contract money, that's not just Derek's problem. It becomes your problem the moment you sign joint tax returns or accept benefits from fraudulent activity. I haven't looked at our taxes in years. Derek's accountant handles everything. Exactly. Which means you're potentially complicit in financial fraud through willful ignorance. James let that sink in before continuing. I'm not trying to scare you, sweetheart. I'm trying to protect you. If Morrison Tech's house of cards collapses, you need to be on the right side of that collapse, not buried underneath it. Madison felt her daughter kick hard against her ribs, as if the baby already understood the gravity of their situation. What do you need from me? Access to Morrison Tech's financial records. Specifically, expense reports, travel vouchers, and entertainment budgets for the past year. If Derek's been misappropriating funds, it'll show up in those documents. That's privileged information. Derek would never. Derek gave you full access to his company files when you were Morrison Tech's unofficial CFO during the startup years, James interrupted. Your name is still on several of the company's account access lists. I checked. Madison stared at her father with dawning realization. You've already investigated this. Thoroughly. I've done preliminary research to determine if a full investigation is warranted. What I need now is evidence to justify expanding that investigation. James took his daughter's hand. Maddie, I would never ask you to do something that compromises your values. But I am asking you to consider whether Derek's values are worth protecting anymore. Inside the ballroom, Madison could see Derek through the glass walls, Vanessa back at his side, both of them laughing with investors as if the Attorney General's appearance had been nothing more than an awkward interruption. They looked perfect together, young, ambitious, uncomplicated by things like pregnancy and family obligations. "He called our daughter a domestic concern that drags him down," Madison said quietly. James's hand tightened on hers. "Then I'd say Derek's already made his choice about where his loyalties lie. The question is, what choice are you going to make?" Madison thought about the life she'd imagined when she married Derek: partnership, family, building something meaningful together. She thought about the reality of the past 8 months: isolation, humiliation, being erased from her own husband's life because she didn't fit his corporate image. She thought about her daughter, who would be born in 2 months, and what lessons that little girl would learn about self-worth and standing up for yourself. "I'll get you the documents," Madison said. "But Dad, I need something from you first." "Name it." "I need you to help me understand exactly what I'm walking into. If I do this, if I expose Derek's fraud, what happens to Morrison Tech? What happens to the 400 employees who depend on that company for their livelihoods?" James's expression turned grave. "Honestly, if the fraud is as extensive as I suspect, Morrison Tech faces potential debarment from federal contracts, which could trigger a financial crisis. Derek would likely face criminal charges for misappropriation of funds and possibly securities fraud if he's misrepresented the company's financial health to investors. The company could collapse. The company could be restructured under new management. The employees would likely be protected through bankruptcy proceedings or acquisition by a larger firm." James squeezed her hand. "Maddie, I know this is devastating. But corruption doesn't just hurt the people who commit it. It hurts everyone connected to it. The longer Derek's fraud continues, the more people will be impacted when it inevitably comes to light." Madison nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what her father was telling her. This wasn't about revenge on an unfaithful husband. This was about preventing a larger catastrophe and protecting people who had no idea their CEO was gambling with their futures. "I'll need a few days to access the files without raising Derek's suspicion," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "But Madison?" James waited until she met his eyes. "Once you start down this road, there's no going back. Derek will know you betrayed him. Your marriage will be over in every sense that matters. It's already over, Dad. He made that clear tonight." Madison placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. "Now I just need to make sure she grows up knowing her mother had the courage to do the right thing, even when it cost everything." They stood together on the terrace, father and daughter, while inside the gala continued and Derek Morrison celebrated an anniversary that would soon be revealed as the beginning of his company's end. The guest bedroom in her father's Georgetown brownstone smelled like old books and furniture polish, familiar scents from Madison's childhood that now offered comfort in ways her own home no longer could. She'd left the gala without saying goodbye to Derek, letting her father drive her to the house where she'd grown up, the house that still felt more like home than anywhere else. Now, at 2 a.m, Madison sat cross-legged on the bed with her laptop open, accessing Morrison Tech's financial systems with the administrative credentials Derek had never bothered to revoke. He'd probably forgotten she still had access, too focused on his affair and his company's image to remember that his wife had once been integral to Morrison Tech's operations. The expense reports loaded slowly, months of data appearing on her screen in neat columns and categories. Madison's accounting background from her MBA days made the irregularities immediately obvious, even before she started digging deeper. Dinner with investors, $4,500 at Le Bernardin. Except Madison recognized the date, Derek's birthday last month, when he'd claimed to be working late but had actually been celebrating with Vanessa according to Instagram photos Madison had found and immediately wished she hadn't. Business development trip, $12,000 for a weekend in Napa Valley. The hotel was a romantic vineyard resort, not the kind of place where serious business discussions happened. The dates coincided with Vanessa's mysteriously timed vacation days. Client entertainment, $8,000 at Tiffany's, listed as corporate gifts. Madison pulled up the itemized receipt and felt her stomach turn. A diamond tennis bracelet. Not the kind of gift you gave to a corporate client unless you were hoping to trigger bribery investigations. She spent 3 hours documenting everything, taking screenshots, cross-referencing dates with Vanessa's social media posts and Derek's calendar. The pattern was damning and obvious. Derek had been systematically billing his affair with Vanessa to Morrison Tech's federal contracts, disguising personal expenses as business development. But it was worse than simple fraud. As Madison dug deeper into the files, she found evidence of something that made her legal training sound alarm bells. Derek had been inflating Morrison Tech's revenue projections to justify higher compensation packages for himself and selected executives. The federal contracts were being listed at values 30% higher than their actual worth. Investor presentations showed customer acquisition numbers that didn't match the company's actual sales records. This wasn't just an unfaithful husband misusing company money. This was securities fraud, potentially criminal misrepresentation to investors and federal agencies. Madison's phone buzzed. A text from Derek. "Where are you? You left without telling me. People are asking questions." She stared at the message, then at the screen full of evidence that could destroy the man she'd married. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Once you start down this road, there's no going back." Madison typed her response carefully. "I'm at my father's house. I needed space to think about our conversation." Derek's reply came immediately. "We need to talk about tonight. Your father was completely out of line. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for me?" The audacity nearly made her laugh. Derek was worried about embarrassment while she'd spent hours discovering the extent of his fraud. "We'll talk tomorrow. I'm tired." She put the phone down and returned to the financial records, her hands shaking slightly as she compiled everything into a comprehensive folder. Names, dates, amounts, supporting documentation. She even found emails between Derek and Vanessa discussing how to categorize personal expenses to avoid detection. "Can't sleep?" Madison looked up to find her father in the doorway, wearing the old Yale Law sweatshirt he'd had since before she was born. "I found everything you need for a full investigation," she said quietly. "And Dad, it's worse than we thought." James crossed the room and sat beside her, studying the laptop screen with the systematic attention he'd once used to review evidence before major prosecutions. His expression grew progressively darker as Madison walked him through her findings. "Jesus, Madison. This is extensive." He pulled up one of the emails she'd flagged. "He's not even being subtle about it. These communications basically admit to deliberate misrepresentation. Can you use this? Is it enough?" "It's more than enough. This is a federal prosecutor's dream case, clear documentation, obvious intent, multiple violations spanning months." James looked at his daughter with something like awe. "Maddie, do you understand what you've just handed me? This evidence doesn't just justify an investigation. It practically guarantees indictments." Madison felt the weight of that statement settle over her. Derek will go to prison. Derek will face serious federal charges. Whether he goes to prison depends on his cooperation and the ultimate extent of the fraud. James's voice was gentle. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this? Once I pass this evidence to federal prosecutors, there's no taking it back." "I'm certain." Madison's voice was steady despite the tears threatening. "Not because I want to hurt Derek, but because this is bigger than our marriage. He's defrauding federal agencies, lying to investors, and putting hundreds of employees at risk. Someone has to stop him before more people get hurt." James nodded slowly. "Okay. I'll need you to provide a formal statement outlining how you obtained this information and confirming its authenticity. The prosecutors will want to establish chain of custody." "When?" "Tomorrow. I'll arrange a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'll want to move quickly once they see what you found." He paused. "Madison, you should also speak with a divorce attorney. Immediately." The word felt heavy in the quiet room. Divorce. The end of 5 years of marriage, the dissolution of the life she'd tried so hard to build. "I know a good one," Madison said. Sarachan recommended her when we had lunch last month. James raised an eyebrow. You've been having lunch with Derek's former marketing director? Sarah reached out a few weeks ago. Said she wanted to check on me, make sure I was okay given Derek's pattern of behavior with her replacement. Madison smiled without humor. She was trying to warn me without violating her NDA. At the time, I thought she was just being bitter about losing her job. Now I understand she was trying to help. Smart woman. She probably suspected Derek was heading toward the kind of trouble that would eventually implicate everyone around him. James closed the laptop carefully. Get some sleep, sweetheart. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. After her father left, Madison lay in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of the Georgetown brownstone. Somewhere below, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. Outside, a car passed occasionally, headlights briefly illuminating the bedroom ceiling before fading back to darkness. Her daughter kicked, a strong insistent movement that made Madison place both hands on her belly. I'm sorry your father turned out to be someone we can't trust, she whispered to the baby. But I promise you'll grow up knowing that your mother and grandfather did the right thing. Even when it cost us everything. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Derek. I don't appreciate being abandoned at my own gala. Whatever game you and your father are playing, it needs to stop. We're married, Madison. That means we're supposed to be a team. Madison stared at the message, then at the laptop containing evidence of Derek's fraud. The irony of him invoking their marriage while systematically betraying every promise he'd made was almost unbearable. She didn't respond. Instead, she forwarded Derek's text to her father, followed by a simple message of her own. Documentation of his mindset and lack of awareness about the investigation. Might be useful. James's response came quickly. Very useful. Screenshot everything. His communications could be evidence of consciousness of guilt or lack thereof. Get some rest, Maddie. Tomorrow we fight. Madison set her phone aside and closed her eyes, feeling her daughter's movements gradually settle into sleep. Tomorrow they would fight. Tomorrow she would walk into the U.S. Attorney's office and provide evidence that would destroy her husband's company and likely send him to prison. Tomorrow she would officially become a whistleblower against the man she'd once loved. But tonight, in her father's house with her daughter safe inside her, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness, the situation was far too devastating for that. But certainty. The bone-deep knowledge that she was doing the right thing for the right reasons, regardless of the cost. Derek Morrison had built his empire on fraud and betrayal. Now Madison Hart was going to ensure that empire fell on the only person who deserved to be buried beneath it. The U.S. Attorney's Office occupied a brutalist government building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered with less than perfectly legal intentions. Madison sat in a conference room on the 8th floor, her father beside her and a digital recorder capturing every word of her statement. Across the table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison, no relation to Derek, thankfully, reviewed the financial documents Madison had provided with the focused intensity of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a career-making case. Mrs. Morrison, Rachel said, looking up from her laptop, I need to confirm something for the record. You obtained these documents using administrative access credentials that were legitimately issued to you during your previous involvement with Morrison Tech's financial operations. Is that correct? Yes, Madison replied. When Morrison Tech was in its startup phase, I served as unofficial CFO while Derek focused on product development and fundraising. He gave me full access to all financial systems. When the company hired a professional accounting team, nobody ever revoked my credentials. And you accessed these records when? Last night, after the company gala. I'd suspected Derek was misusing company funds, but I didn't have proof until I reviewed the expense reports and cross-referenced them with other documentation. Rachel made notes on her legal pad. Walk me through what you found. Start with the most egregious examples. For the next 2 hours, Madison detailed every fraudulent expense, every inflated projection, every instance where Derek had essentially stolen from federal contracts to fund his affair. She showed emails, receipts, calendar entries that proved business trips were actually romantic getaways. She explained how Derek had systematically misrepresented Morrison Tech's financial health to investors and government agencies. Rachel's expression grew progressively more severe as the evidence mounted. "This is extensive," she said finally. "Mr. Morrison hasn't just committed fraud. He's committed multiple felonies across several jurisdictions. Federal contract fraud, securities fraud, wire fraud, potentially money laundering if we can prove he was deliberately concealing the origins of misappropriated funds." "What happens now?" Madison asked. "Now we open a formal investigation. We'll subpoena Morrison Tech's complete financial records, interview employees, analyze bank statements and wire transfers. We'll build an airtight case that can survive any defense attorney Derek hires." Rachel leaned forward. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to be honest with you. This investigation will destroy your husband's company. Morrison Tech will lose its federal contracts immediately once we notify the contracting agencies of the fraud allegations. The company will likely face bankruptcy within months. I understand. Do you?" Rachel's tone wasn't unkind, but it was direct. "Because you need to fully comprehend what you're setting in motion. 400 employees will lose their jobs. Investors will lose millions. Your husband will face decades in federal prison. And you'll be known as the whistleblower who brought down a successful tech company. I'll also be known as the woman who stopped a fraud that was getting worse every day," Madison replied steadily. "Derek wasn't going to stop, Ms. Morrison. He was going to keep lying and stealing until the whole thing collapsed on everyone connected to Morrison Tech. At least this way, the employees will have legal protections through bankruptcy proceedings. At least this way, investors will understand why their money disappeared instead of wondering if they could have prevented it." Rachel studied Madison for a long moment. "You've thought this through." "I've had months to think about it. Months of watching my husband become someone I don't recognize. Months of realizing that the man I married never really existed." Madison placed her hands on her belly. "My daughter deserves better than growing up with a father who teaches her that fraud and betrayal are acceptable if they serve your ambitions." "Noted for the record." Rachel gathered her documents. "I'll need you to sign formal statements attesting to the authenticity of these documents and your voluntary cooperation with this investigation. Attorney General Carter, I assume you'll want to recuse yourself from any direct involvement given your relationship to the witness." "Already done," James confirmed. "I've notified my office that I'm personally connected to this case. My deputy will handle any coordination between state and federal agencies." "Good. Mrs. Morrison, one more question." Rachel's expression became more personal. "What are you going to tell your husband?" Madison had been dreading that question. "The truth. That I know what he's been doing, that I've provided evidence to federal prosecutors, and that our marriage is over." "When?" "As soon as I leave here. There's no point delaying the inevitable." "That conversation could be dangerous," Rachel warned. "Men facing federal prosecution sometimes react unpredictably. I'd strongly recommend having someone with you when you confront him." "I'll be there," James said firmly. "And Madison, you're not going back to that house alone. We'll arrange for movers to pack your things while Derek is out of the property. He's going to know something's wrong the moment I walk in with you," Madison pointed out. "Let him know. Let him see exactly what happens when you underestimate the daughter of a federal prosecutor and a federal judge." James's voice carried the steel that had made him legendary in courtrooms. "Derek Morrison is about to learn that actions have consequences. The harder lesson comes later, when he realizes just how many consequences." 2 hours later, Madison stood outside the house she'd shared with Derek, her father beside her and Rachel Morrison's business card in her purse. The federal prosecutor had insisted on providing Madison with direct contact information in case Derek's reaction escalated beyond conversation. Derek's car sat in the driveway, which meant he was home. probably working, since he'd missed an entire day at the office dealing with the fallout from the previous night's gala. Madison had received 17 increasingly angry text messages throughout the day, each one demanding to know where she was and why she'd humiliated him in front of investors. She hadn't responded to any of them. The time for responses had passed. "Ready?" James asked quietly. "No," Madison admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway." They entered through the front door, finding Derek in his home office exactly as Madison had predicted. He looked up as they walked in, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something like fear as he registered James Carter's presence. "Madison, what's going on? Why is your father here?" "We need to talk, Derek. About Morrison Tech, about your relationship with Vanessa, and about the federal investigation that's being opened into your company's finances." The color drained from Derek's face so completely that for a moment Madison thought he might faint. "Federal investigation? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the systematic fraud you've been committing for the past 8 months, Madison said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The misappropriation of federal contract funds to pay for your affair. The inflated revenue projections you've been giving to investors. The falsified expense reports and fraudulent financial disclosures." Derek stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "How do you, Madison, what did you do?" "I accessed Morrison Tech's financial records and provided them to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They have everything, Derek. Emails, receipts, bank statements. Enough evidence to charge you with multiple federal felonies. You betrayed me." Derek's voice was barely above a whisper, shock and fury warring in his expression. "You went to federal prosecutors with privileged company information. You sabotaged my business." "I exposed fraud," Madison corrected. "There's a difference. You destroyed everything I've built." Derek's composure shattered completely. 5 years of work, millions of dollars in investment, 400 employees, all of it gone because you couldn't handle your husband finding happiness with someone else? James Carter stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "Mr. Morrison, I'd suggest you very carefully consider your next words. You're currently facing federal investigation for multiple counts of fraud. Adding witness intimidation to that list would be unwise." Derek turned his fury on James. "This is your doing. You've been planning this since Madison came crying to you about my relationship with Vanessa. You couldn't stand that your daughter's husband didn't worship at the altar of the Carter family legacy. Actually, I've been planning this since I discovered you were defrauding federal agencies and putting national security contracts at risk," James replied calmly. "The fact that you've been betraying my daughter personally just made the investigation more personally satisfying." "National security?" Derek laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Morrison Tech makes enterprise software. We're not exactly dealing with classified information. Morrison Tech holds contracts with the Department of Defense for communications infrastructure software," James said. "The same software you've been developing using funds fraudulently diverted from those contracts. The same software whose cost you've been systematically inflating through false expense reports. I'd say that qualifies as putting national security at risk." Derek's face went from pale to ashen. He clearly hadn't considered the national security implications of his fraud, hadn't thought past the immediate gratification of funding his affair and building his company's valuation. "I want to speak to my attorney," he said finally. "Excellent idea," James agreed. "You're going to need a very good one. I'd recommend someone with federal criminal defense experience. White-collar fraud cases are quite complex. This is insane." Derek looked at Madison with something between betrayal and incomprehension. "You're really going to do this? Destroy my company, send me to prison, all because I fell in love with someone else?" "I'm doing this because you committed fraud," Madison said quietly. "Because you lied to investors, stole from federal agencies, and put hundreds of employees at risk with your reckless behavior. Your relationship with Vanessa is just the mechanism through which you rationalize the fraud." "I never rationalized anything. Those expenses were legitimate business development costs," Derek, stop. Madison held up a hand. I've seen the evidence. I've read the emails where you and Vanessa discussed how to categorize personal expenses to avoid detection. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just never imagined you'd get caught. Derek sank back into his chair, the fight suddenly draining out of him. He looked at Madison with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, regret, maybe, or just the realization that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now you hire an attorney and prepare for federal indictment, James said. The U.S. Attorney's Office will likely offer you a cooperation deal if you provide information about any other individuals involved in the fraud. I'd strongly recommend you take whatever deal they offer. And our marriage? Derek looked at Madison. Is over, she said simply. I've already retained a divorce attorney. You'll be served with papers within the week. Because I'm being investigated for fraud. Because you've been betraying me for 8 months and called our daughter a burden. Madison's voice finally cracked slightly. Because you chose your ambition and your affair over our family. The fraud investigation is just the consequence of those choices, Derek. Not the cause. They left Derek sitting in his office, staring at nothing, his empire crumbling around him. In the car, Madison finally let herself cry, not for Derek, but for the life she'd imagined and the man she'd thought she married. You did the right thing, James said, starting the engine. I know, Madison replied. So why does it feel so terrible? Because ending things is always painful, even when it's necessary. Even when the person you're ending things with doesn't deserve your tears. James reached over to squeeze her hand. But Maddie, you're going to survive this. You're going to raise your daughter and build a life you can be proud of. And someday, Derek Morrison will be nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition isn't tempered by integrity. Madison nodded, placing both hands on her belly where her daughter was moving restlessly. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. Just heard about the investigation. Thank you for having the courage I couldn't find. You saved a lot of people from getting hurt worse. She showed the message to her father, who smiled grimly. See? You're already making a difference. As they drove through the city toward her father's house, Madison watched the lights blur past and thought about consequences. Derek would face his for the fraud and betrayal. She would face hers for choosing truth over comfortable lies. But her daughter would grow up knowing that her mother and grandfather had fought for justice, even when it cost everything. That inheritance was worth more than any amount of money Derek's company could have generated. 2 months later, Madison gave birth to Elena Catherine Hart at Georgetown University Hospital. James Carter held his granddaughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face, and Madison understood that some legacies were worth any price. Derek Morrison was indicted on 14 counts of federal fraud 3 days after Elena's birth. He never came to meet his daughter. But that was fine. Elena had a family who would teach her about integrity, courage, and the quiet strength it took to stand up for what was right. She didn't need anything else.